On Broadstone Avenue, workers clocked in each noon with the same ritual: line up, grab a stainless steel tray, and wait for David Cole's ladle to pour steaming soup. He wasn't just the canteen cook. He was the man who fed birthdays, retirements, and late shifts. The one people joked kept the company alive with salt and spice. But behind the white jacket and weary smile, something darker had been simmering for years. It started small. An intern doubled over after lunch. A secretary fainted in the copy room. Isolated, dismissed, until stretchers rolled out week after week, and one phrase kept circling back: they had just eaten at the cafeteria. What no one knew was that between sacks of rice and drums of oil sat hidden bottles with no labels, and inside David's grease-stained notebook were lists of names, marked in red, scratched like recipes for revenge. This is the story of a company that trusted the wrong cook, and of a kitchen meant for nourishment that became an execution ground. Welcome to Justice Uncovered. Subscribe and turn on the bell, because the storm behind the mask is only beginning. At 12:47 p.m., the hospital corridor convulsed with noise and bodies. Blue-shirted employees, still carrying the smell of cafeteria lunch on their clothes, were laid out in uneven rows of stretchers. Some gagged, some seized. Others lay still as Roman IV bags swung above them like pale lanterns. The fluorescent lights flickered, exposing each spasm with cruel clarity. Sirens screamed outside, ambulance doors slammed, and the staccato beep of monitors fractured into broken alarms. Shoes struck the linoleum in hurried bursts, the rhythm of doctors sprinting, nurses shouting clipped orders. The air carried a sharp sting of disinfectant, yet beneath it lingered something alien, the sour tang of chili sauce and broth, clinging to fabric, ghosting the sterile halls with the scent of a communal meal gone rancid. Another one's crashing, a nurse barked, her voice cut like glass, a monitor flatlined. Outside the ER, live cameras blinked red. News anchors spoke in grave tones, the headline unrolling in capital letters: "Mystery Illness Sweeps Office." The feed cut between the convoy of ambulances and the faces of families pressing against glass doors, their eyes wide with the terror of not knowing. Inside, staff counted bodies not in single digits, but in dozens. The cafeteria lunch hour had turned into a war zone without warning. Doctors whispered theories in corners, voices low but urgent. Allergic reaction, foodborne bacteria, even terrorism. Yet as stretchers kept arriving, those theories shrank into irrelevance. A pattern emerged only in sensation: the metallic breath of the afflicted, the red stain on their cuffs where sauce had spilled, the acrid smell rising each time a paramedic pulled off a jacket. The storm had no face yet, but its trail was marked by taste and odor. By 1:12 p.m., the hospital lobby looked like a waiting room for catastrophe. Reporters craned for glimpses, microphones thrust like weapons. What did they eat? One asked aloud, though no one answered. In the emergency bay, the soundscape shifted from chaos to exhaustion, doctors shouting less, silence spreading wider. Bodies were being wheeled not to surgery but to the morgue. The survivors moaned through masks. One whispered, voice shaking, "It was just soup." The phrase repeated itself down the ward like a chant of disbelief, simple and absurd. Just soup. Just sauce. Words that once belonged to comfort now tasted of iron and despair. Outside at 2:03 p.m., camera drones hovered above the company headquarters. The parking lot, normally filled with laughter during lunch breaks, was roped with yellow tape. Police officers moved with stiff precision, guarding doors as though a ghost still roamed inside. The cafeteria windows reflected only clouds, the glass opaque, as though hiding the storm that had begun there. Days passed, and the story thickened like a sauce left to cool. The city speculated, blogs churned, families demanded answers. The phrase "office plague" surfaced in headlines. No source was named, but every retelling returned to the cafeteria, to the communal pots of soup and the scarlet sauce ladled without suspicion. It was no longer food. It was evidence. 1 week later, the funeral took place. The church overflowed. Wooden coffins lined the aisle in military symmetry, each draped with lilies and chrysanthemums. The air was dense with wax smoke, a slow suffocation compared to the frenzy of the hospital, but suffocation nonetheless. The mourners wore black, but the coffins wore silver. On each one rested a cafeteria spoon, its metal polished to a merciless gleam. Once used for scooping warmth, it now lay motionless, symbol of betrayal. The spoons looked identical, stripped of personality, as if death had leveled everyone into the same anonymous silence. Rows of them caught the candlelight, reflecting back a cold constellation of grief. Some whispered prayers, others demanded retribution. Yet beneath the sobbing and sermons was an unspoken recognition. This had not been random. Meals were supposed to nourish, not annihilate. Soup was supposed to heal, not corrode. Something deliberate pulsed beneath the surface, an unseen hand guiding the storm. In the back pew, cameras clicked. Reporters noted the flowers, the spoons, the extraordinary detail that every family had chosen to honor their dead with the same utensil, as if instinctively aware that the spoon itself had become a relic of betrayal. The storm inside had only revealed its first cloud. The mask that served these workers daily had not yet been pulled away, but the resentment that brewed behind it was already shaping the city's nightmares. On the final coffin, a spoon tilted slightly, sliding as if it could fall. Its polished surface caught the flame of a candle and cast a fleeting red shimmer across the aisle like blood remembered. But this was only the beginning. David Cole had worked in the company canteen for 20 years, long enough that his presence had become part of the building's rhythm. Every noon at 12 p.m., the sound of his ladle striking the steel pot was as predictable as the elevator bell. To the younger workers, he was Uncle Dave, a figure who seemed permanent, almost institutional, like the smell of boiled rice that clung to the walls. He was the man who knew who preferred soup without onions, who asked for extra sauce, who came late and needed leftovers held aside. He was the mask of care, steady and unchanging, feeding 300 mouths without complaint. The dishes carried his imprint. The soup, thick with vegetables, steam rising like a prayer, had been called comfort in a bowl. The red chili sauce, sharp and fiery, was his signature. It was passed around tables as though it bound people together, office hierarchies dissolving in the act of sharing spice. For years, workers said they felt like family in that cafeteria, but families have fractures, and the cracks were visible if one listened closely. At the company's 20th anniversary, executives gathered on stage, their suits lit by chandeliers. Glasses clinked, applause swelled, and the CEO raised a toast to the team that built this success. Every department was named: finance, legal, HR. No one mentioned the canteen. David stood at the far end of the hall in his grease-stained whites, balancing a tray of roasted meat. The applause thundered around him, but none of it touched him. In that moment he seemed less a worker than a shadow carrying burdens across the floor. Humiliations were never shouted, they came as quiet dismissals, small erasures repeated until they calcified. A manager once joked in the open, "He's not staff, he's seasoning." Laughter rippled, sharp and thoughtless. Another called across the room, "Kitchen boy, bring more plates." No one corrected him. The words sank like oil into cloth, leaving a stain invisible to others but permanent to the one wearing it. Even the young found ways to mock him. Interns filmed themselves at lunch, exaggerating disgust as they sipped his soup. The clip went viral inside the office chat. Prison food courtesy of Uncle Dave. They laughed, he smiled faintly, and the mask held. But behind his eyes something quiet shifted, like the air before a storm. He carried a small notebook, its pages warped with grease, the edges browned as if by fire. Most assumed it was a recipe book. He wrote in it constantly, pausing between serving trays to jot quick lines. No one asked what he wrote. The book smelled faintly of chili and smoke, and when he closed it, he held it as though it contained more than instructions for soup. There was also the locked drawer. Janitors saw him kneel before it after midnight, keys clinking softly. He always shut the kitchen last. Long after the building was empty and dark, his pots still clanged. One cleaner recalled the eerie sensation of hearing the ladle stir at 11 p.m., like he was cooking for ghosts. The cafeteria lights cast long shadows when the crowd was gone. Alone, David would stand in the middle of the room, breathing in the silence, the scent of onions and broth heavy in the air. The mask of Uncle Dave, kind, reliable, unshakable, was stitched tight, but resentment pressed beneath it, a storm building where no one could see. On one particular night at 11:02 p.m., a security camera caught a moment that seemed ordinary yet uncanny. He sat at a table, his apron untied, his hands resting on a small bottle. The label had been scraped clean, leaving only adhesive scars. He ran his thumb over it slowly, as if memorizing its blankness. His eyes were not weary but vacant, a void deeper than exhaustion. The camera caught the reflection of fluorescent light glinting off the glass, a shimmer that looked like steel. Then he tucked it away and switched off the lights. To those who passed him daily, David was only the cook, the background figure, the man who smiled as he ladled soup. Yet in every dismissal, every erasure, his identity was rubbed thinner, until he resembled the bottle with its label peeled away, something that once had a name, now just an anonymous vessel. The mask of Uncle Dave remained intact, but inside the storm rumbled, unseen and unanswered. And in the dark of the kitchen, behind locked drawers and notebooks stained with grease, that storm was learning to take shape. At 9 p.m. the kitchen belonged to him and the hum of the refrigeration units. The building above slept behind glass, but down here the stainless counters still held a ghost warmth from the dinner rush. Steam had long since thinned to breathe. David Cole loosened the knot of his apron and listened to the room's small noises, the tick of cooling pans, the rattle of a spoon left too near the edge, the steady shiver of the walk-in's condenser. The scent of onions and chili hung in the air like an argument that never ended. He was the mask again, solitary and uncomplaining, yet the mask felt tight across the bones of his face. Beneath it, resentment gathered like storm water in a clogged drain. Earlier that afternoon he had stood under fluorescent panels in HR, hat in his hands. The director smiled a practiced smile and spoke without looking at him for long. "Canteen isn't a career, David. Support staff don't get raises." She said support the way people say spare or trivial, a word that sat lightly in the mouth and heavily in the heart. He nodded once and felt something imperceptible tilt inside him, like a pot coming just to boil. The manager in charge of facilities had his own grammar of dismissal. At 1:10 p.m. he tossed a half-eaten tray into the bin and flicked sauce off his fingers. "Too greasy," he said, not to David but to the air, as if grease were a moral failure. An intern laughed. In the recorded chatter of the cafeteria, the moment barely registered, a minor percussion under the clatter of cutlery, yet the sentence stuck to David's skin with the persistence of oil. He could feel it hours later while scrubbing sheet pans, could hear the consonants in the scrape of steel wool. Money pressed in from the outside world with a colder hand. His wife's dialysis had become the household's second heartbeat, the machine starting each night at 9:30 p.m., the thin mechanical hiss filling their small apartment. He had sold his old car, had taken an extra Sunday shift, had learned to fold bills in precise stacks as if neatness might multiply them. Still, the envelopes arrived with red stamps. Debt felt like a spice you couldn't taste, but that made everything burn anyway. At the dinner table, love drained away without a scene. His wife ate the soup he set before her without tasting it, eyes on the middle distance as if trying to remember a shore she once knew. The son asked once, then twice, then finally without hope, "Why never at my game?" David promised and did not come. He was always here when the lights above turned off, when the building shed its day mask and left him alone with pots and lists and the long ache of service. The interns filmed him at 12:27 p.m. on a Tuesday, dipping spoons into his vegetable soup and performing disgust for a camera. "Prison soup," one said, brows raised in theatrical pity. The clip gathered hearts and laughing faces on private channels. When he passed their table later with extra napkins, they went quiet and then giggled when he had moved on. He tightened his jaw and felt the storm inside shift its weight. He had always kept a notebook. It had been a living book once. Garlic ratios jotted in grease-streaked margins, notes on how long to simmer bones for the deepest broth. Now the pages curled at the corners and the ink lines narrowed. Recipes became entries. Names appeared with symbols, a circle, a slash, a small red X. The language changed too, becoming incantation. Salted with laughter, 12:46 p.m., 3 interns. Seasoned with debt, HR, 2 p.m. Thickened with silence, missed game. Sun's eyes, 7 p.m. He wrote quickly as if catching the weather before it slipped away. The locked drawer in the prep station took a different key than the walk-in. He kept both on a ring at his belt, and the clink of them was an intimate sound, the sound of a person permitted access. After 10 p.m. he would kneel, insert the narrow key, and slide the drawer open. The bottles inside were ordinary, even humble, plastic, cloudy from repeated washings, their labels scraped clean until only scabs of glue remained. He ran a thumb over the scars where names had been, feeling the tacky edges like the memory of hands that had once held him more gently. He did not acquire the industrial preservative by accident. He asked a supplier who dealt in bulk spices, paid in cash, and asked for no invoice. The cartons were plain, the kind stacked in any storeroom in the city. He decanted it himself at 10:38 p.m., using a funnel he would later wash with quiet meticulousness. When the clear liquid met the bottom of the bottle, it made a small sound, a throat clearing. He taped over the seam and wrote nothing on the side, then slid the bottle among the sesame oil and vinegar on the crowded shelf. Danger hid best when it looked like the familiar. The red chili sauce had always been his signature, a fuse of heat that brought the room together. Couples on the verge of breakups passed it and smiled for a moment. Teams at war over budgets found their tongues loosened. The bottle's shape fit a hand perfectly. The sauce's gloss caught the light like lacquer. Now the color reminded him of something less celebratory. The heat that made people laugh could also make them sweat, could force the body to confess. He stirred the pot slowly and watched the surface take on a sheen like fresh paint. It seemed to him a mirror capable of keeping secrets. When the building emptied, the kitchen's sounds grew intimate, almost invasive. The walk-in's motor droned a steady note. The clock clicked softly at the top of each minute, small guillotine strokes. He moved through stations like a priest closing a sanctuary. The mask of Uncle Dave stayed on out of habit, the hands still wiped, the knives still aligned, the floor still mopped in long, patient swaths. But his breath had a different cadence, and the storm inside changed tempo, aligning itself with the steady machines. He heard the dialysis machine again, even here, a phantom hiss threaded through the ductwork. In his mind, the hose connected not to his wife's arm but to the building itself, a long siphon drawing out whatever warmth he placed into the day and returning only the cold fact of necessity. He closed his eyes and could see the fluorescent wash of HR, the managerial flick of fingers, the boy's question without an answer. When he opened them, the room felt sharper, knife clean. At 6:15 p.m. that same day, the manager had leaned over the serving line and said, "Kitchen boy, bring more plates." The phrase arrived without malice, which was worse. He chose not to answer. He turned instead to the shelf of condiments and adjusted the angle of a bottle whose label could not be read. It seemed a small rebellion, that adjustment, as pointless and precise as aligning silverware before a banquet of ghosts. He began to test, not in ways that left visible marks, but in ways that could be explained. An extra minute of simmer here, a different heat there. He watched faces when they ate. He took notes on who returned for seconds and who dabbed at their lips with napkins, eyes watering. He wrote with the patience of a surveyor, mapping a town that thought it needed no maps. The family apartment at 9:45 p.m. smelled like cleaner and plastic. He set a bowl before his wife and she lifted the spoon dutifully. "Thank you," she said, and the words did not reach him. The machine hummed its continuous sentence. His daughter's photo on the shelf showed her smiling at a beach 2 years and a life away. He rinsed the bowl and placed it in the rack. The storm inside did not rage. It congealed, becoming useful. Back at the canteen, he took out the notebook and opened to a fresh page. The paper absorbed the ink the way cloth absorbs smoke. He wrote with a slowness that felt like control. Next dish, collective silence. The phrase entered the book like a final ingredient, invisible but decisive. He rose and slid the notebook into his coat. He checked the line of bottles, the array of names that had become no names, the little congregation of ordinary things. He shut off the prep lights, leaving only the blue glow of the walk-in through its oval window. Inside, metal shelving held pans and tubs arranged with soldierly discipline. He stepped in for a last check, the breath of cold wrapping his arms. At 11:08 p.m. he pulled the door and the seal folded home with a rubbery sigh. From inside the prep drawer came a brief rattle as a plastic bottle quivered and settled, a sound no louder than a trapped insect. It sounded, to anyone who might have been listening, like a heartbeat learning the shape of its cage. At 12:15 p.m. the cafeteria swelled with its daily ritual. Shoes tapped against tile as workers filed in, a long river of blue shirts and plastic ID cards swinging on lanyards. The air shimmered with the sound of trays being lifted, coins sliding across registers, voices rising and falling in the half-cheerful drone of routine. Overhead, the fluorescent lamps hummed, a pale imitation of daylight. At the serving line, David Cole stood behind the steam, ladle in hand, the mask firmly in place. His apron hung clean, his face unreadable, the quiet storm inside sealed by habit. He moved with precision, ladling soup into metal bowls, pouring his red sauce with the same measured tilt. The spoon clinked softly against the rim each time, a rhythm he had repeated for decades. No one watched him closely. They trusted the motion, the mask of care that had fed them year after year. A woman smiled as she held her tray forward. "Extra sauce, Uncle Dave." He obliged, expression flat, eyes briefly reflecting the crimson sheen of the chili. At 12:27 p.m. the cafeteria buzzed at full capacity. Chairs scraped, conversations ricocheted off the walls. The scent of onions, garlic, and simmered vegetables thickened the room. Somewhere an intern joked in a low voice, "Here comes the prison soup," and the table erupted in muffled laughter. David's ladle struck the pot with a harder sound than usual, though no one seemed to notice. At 12:32 p.m. the first collapse came. A man halfway through his bowl dropped his fork. His hand spasmed once, his head dipped forward, striking the tray with a dull metallic clang. For a moment those around him thought he had fainted from heat. A colleague shook his shoulder and laughed nervously. "Wake up, man, lunch break's not nap time." But the body didn't stir. The laughter thinned to silence. By 12:34 p.m. 3 more convulsed. One woman clutched at her throat, knocking her water to the floor. Another slid from his chair, limbs jerking as if pulled by unseen strings. Soup spilled across the table, dripping to the floor in red streaks. The cafeteria's chatter fractured into gasps, screams, the clatter of trays dropped midair. The mask of routine was gone, something darker had surfaced. A man at the far end gagged violently, his face draining of color. He vomited across the table, the stench of bile mixing with the sharp, chilly tang. A woman stumbled toward the exit, but her legs buckled. "Help! Someone help!" she shouted, voice cracking. The room shifted from communal ritual to battlefield in seconds. By 12:36 p.m., panic spread like fire. Some tried to drag victims upright, others pushed blindly toward doors. A chair toppled, then another. The neon lights flickered overhead, throwing jerky shadows across the floor. A man cried out, "It's the food, don't eat the food." Hands swiped trays from tables, soup splashing in arcs, staining sleeves, leaving burns of color. The metallic smell grew stronger, searing nostrils, coating tongues with the illusion of pennies dissolved in heat. At 12:37 p.m., the cafeteria broke completely. The air filled with screams, the high-pitched clatter of spoons cascading to tile, the thunder of chairs overturning. It sounded like gunfire, sharp metallic bursts echoing in sequence, as if an unseen shooter had entered the room. People ducked instinctively, shielding their heads, though the only bullets were the silver spoons striking the ground. The storm inside David now lived outside, translated into chaos no one could name. In the corner, a woman pressed against the wall, trembling. She whispered to herself, "It was just soup, just soup." Her words vanished beneath the roar of alarms triggered by someone slamming the emergency button. Red strobes flickered, painting faces with sudden crimson, echoing the sauce that had begun to drip down tables, pooling on the tiles. David stood behind the counter, ladle motionless in his hand. His expression was calm, the mask intact, though his eyes reflected nothing of the panic before him. He looked at the pot of sauce still steaming, as if watching an old friend breathe. Around him, employees clawed at the exit, their cries muffled by the din of falling metal and shattering glass. Somewhere near the center of the room, a pool of spilled soup expanded slowly, its edges spreading across the floor. The liquid was red, thick, glistening under the flickering lights. People slipped, fell, scrambled to their feet. The stain grew wider, as if mapping something invisible onto the linoleum. Viewed from above, it resembled not random spillage but deliberate cartography, the outline of a wound, a map of collective injury written in food. Paramedics would arrive minutes later to a scene already fractured beyond repair. But at that moment, the cafeteria became a theater of collapse, where routine cracked open and revealed the storm beneath. The sound of spoons striking tile did not stop. They kept falling one after another, a metallic chorus that mimicked distant volleys of gunfire, announcing to all who heard that the storm had finally broken through its mask. And in the widening pool of sauce on the floor, shapes took form, lines connected, until it looked like a map no one wanted to read, a map of a wound too large to heal, a geography of betrayal written in red. By 1:10 p.m., the ambulances had lined up outside County General in a metallic procession, each one opening its doors to reveal bodies twitching, vomiting, or already still. The hospital had no rhythm left. The stretchers rolled in without pause, forming a convoy of collapse. Fluorescent light bleached the faces of patients laid along the hallway floors when rooms ran out. Nurses stepped over legs. Roman IV poles rattled against plaster walls, and the air was thick with antiseptic mixed with the sharp, chilly sting that clung to shirts. What once had been the smell of comfort food now spread like smoke from a fire no one could put out. At 1:45 p.m., the waiting room dissolved into hysteria. Families pressed to the glass, fists pounding as they tried to see loved ones. One woman screamed until her voice broke. "He only had soup." A man shouted it too, angrier, as if repeating the phrase might summon sense from madness. Doctors tried to calm them, but the words were stronger than any sedative. Just soup, just sauce. The sentence rang across the ward like an indictment. By 2:20 p.m., the city itself had become a patient. News anchors interrupted programming with the banner, "The plague in the pot." Helicopters hovered above the office building, broadcasting images of the cafeteria under police cordon. Commentators speculated freely, filling silence with theories: food poisoning, bioterror, negligence. No one dared yet name the cook, the man in the apron who had been trusted for 2 decades. His mask still held in the public eye, though it had already cracked in private halls. At 3 p.m., the police chief faced the microphones. Behind him, the flag drooped, limp in the stale air of the press room. His words were careful, choreographed. "We are investigating all possible sources. We cannot confirm any specific cause at this time." A reporter cut in, sharp. "Are you saying this is deliberate?" The chief blinked, sweat collecting at his temples. "We are saying nothing yet." The resentment in the room swelled, cameras flashing like lightning in a storm. Families watching from hospital corridors heard only evasion. They shouted at the screens, demanding names, demanding truth. While the city panicked, investigators moved quietly through the narrow apartment on Ash Street where David Cole had lived for 30 years. It smelled of cooking oil and detergent, and beneath that, a dampness like sorrow. In the bedroom corner, the dialysis machine hummed its relentless monotone. On the kitchen table, they found bills stacked like gravestones: hospital fees, overdue rent, utilities. Each envelope was open but unpaid, the ink of red stamps bleeding through. But it was in the drawer beside the stove where the mask was finally torn away. Inside lay the notebook, oil-stained and warped by steam. Its pages were filled not with recipes but with ledgers of humiliation. Names of colleagues marked with symbols, some circled, some crossed, some struck with violent slashes of red ink. Beside each, short sentences in handwriting cramped and angry, salted with laughter, seasoned with debt, thickened with silence. One page carried a single inscription underlined 3 times, fed faithfully every noon every year. The words looked less like memory than verdict. An officer whispered as he turned the pages, "This isn't food, this is scripture." His partner snapped latex gloves against his wrists and bagged the book. They moved through the apartment with the hush of archaeologists, each object a shard of a hidden storm. On the shelf above the sink, they counted 3 bottles with scraped-off labels, their plastic bodies cloudy, their contents still sloshing faintly. To anyone else, they were condiments. To the investigators, they were evidence of betrayal dressed as ordinary. Back at the hospital, the storm of bodies grew. By 5 p.m., stretchers lined not only the ER but the corridors leading to radiology and surgery. Some patients groaned, clutching stomachs, lips stained red from the sauce. Others lay silent, their faces turned toward the ceiling tiles with vacant eyes. Doctors moved like dancers stumbling through choreography too fast to follow. A nurse pressed gauze to a man's mouth as he coughed blood onto her gloves. She looked at the crimson smear and muttered, "It smells like peppers." By 7 p.m., vigils lit up outside the hospital gates. Families held candles, the flames bending in the night wind, flickering like fragile hearts. They chanted the phrase again, "He only had soup." The words carried across the street into the sterile hallways, where David's name was still unknown, hidden behind the mask of silence. Yet inside the evidence room of the precinct, his identity was already dissolving, written into objects that had shifted from innocent to lethal. The stainless trays from the cafeteria arrived next. Bagged and tagged, they clanged against one another in transport, a metallic dirge echoing through the hall. Technicians laid them on evidence tables, their surfaces reflecting white light. Each tray bore smudges of sauce dried to black crust. The once ordinary objects now looked like grave markers, identical, anonymous, yet carrying the weight of lives ended. One officer stared too long and muttered, "They look like coffins for children." The storm outside the canteen had spread everywhere, through hospitals, media, homes. Yet in the silence of the evidence room, the motif condensed. The trays, the spoons, the notebooks, all relics of betrayal. What had once held food now held history. Near midnight, a technician lifted one tray into a bag. As he tilted it, light struck the surface and revealed a smear the cleaners had missed. It was a faint streak, red gone brown, hardened into the steel like rust. He sealed the bag and marked it, then placed it among dozens of others. The row of trays gleamed under fluorescent tubes, a gallery of grief catalogued and filed. The last camera lingered as the bag settled flat on the shelf. Through the plastic, the streak of red was still visible, a wound preserved. The khaki label read simply, "Evidence." And beneath the silence of locked doors and humming lights, the tray seemed to whisper what no official report dared yet declare. The storm had been cooked, ladled, and served with trust. The Kai inox lay still, tagged and numbered, yet its stain remained, a mark no washing could erase. At 8:06 a.m. the lab smelled of solvents and winter light. Stainless benches held rows of clear vials, each a thumbprint of the previous day's panic. A technician in a paper mask tipped a pipette, a bead trembling at the tip before falling into a rotary mixer. The bottle they had seized from the canteen shelf sat under a directed lamp, its label torn away, a faint aureole of adhesive-catching dust. Someone had written "sesame oil" on the evidence bag in neat block letters, quotation marks added later, as if the phrase itself had become suspicious. The centrifuge started, a low animal purr, and the first printout slid from the spectrometer with a rattle like a cough. "It isn't oil," the technician said. "No flourish. Just the weight of certainty dropping into air." By 9:12 a.m. the conference room at the precinct hummed with the sound of electronics waking. Screens came alive, still frames of the cafeteria line, the ghostly blue of night vision from the kitchen after close. Timestamps burned into corners like small brands. The detective in charge tapped the tip of a pen against the glass. "We narrow here," he said, circling the prep station, the shelf of condiments, the locked drawer. On another monitor, a cleaner leaned on a mop at 11:17 p.m. listening to unseen clatter. The audio crackled, then a memory played back in a different room as an interview clip. The cleaner's voice. He stayed till midnight, pots still clanging, like he was cooking for ghosts. At 10:40 a.m. two plain vans slid into the loading bay behind the canteen. Men and women in muted jackets carried cases the size of hymnals. By 11:02 a.m. tiny cameras were nested in corners like patient spiders. One faced the serving line. Another watched the shelf where the bottle had been found. A third sat inside the walk-in, its lens peering through a wire grid toward rows of pans. The room, stripped of people, exposed its bones, the pale hum of fluorescent bars, the scars on cutting boards, the thin intestine of ductwork coiling overhead. It resembled a theater before the audience arrives, or a chapel before the first candle is lit. Witnesses were heard again, briefly, almost ritualistically, as if speaking their lines might summon the truth faster. He poured from a bottle with no label. A junior server said, "Eyes on the table." Just no label. The phrase seemed to echo against metal. The lack became a presence. The absent name was its own character now, moving through the room like a shadow. At 11:55 a.m. David Cole entered through the back, shoulders stooped beneath a white apron that had not yet known the day's stains. He washed his hands longer than the instructional poster suggested, fingers worrying at each joint with a surgeon's attention. He dried them slowly on a cloth and listened to the room. The cafeteria, empty of bodies, still breathed. Compressor sigh, light buzz, the distant thump of an elevator. The mask arranged itself on his face, neutral, untroubled. The old caretaker returned to his station. But the camera in the corner recorded other meanings. A pause at the shelf, an extra second spent near the bottles, the minute tremor in his right hand that suggested the storm inside had altered its weather. By 12:06 p.m. the first wave of employees arrived, trays pulled from stacks with a rasping sound that set the microphones fizzing. The queuing line formed with its familiar choreography: banter, a joke about meetings, a brief argument about someone cutting in. The red sauce glowed in its pan like lacquer, the steam off the soup raised thin veils. The room smelled alive: starch, acid, garlic, the faint metal hush of steamed steel. Extra sauce, someone said, soft, almost tender like a private code. David obliged, expression calm, hands steady as a metronome. At 12:19 p.m. the hidden camera above the shelf captured a rehearsal perfected by time. He reached for a bottle with no label, the plastic cloudy with age. His thumb sought the seam of tape and found it. For an instant he held it not as a condiment but as an instrument. The lens caught the peculiar intimacy of the grip, fingers stitched to purpose. The cap turned with a small click. The microphone picked up the tremble of liquid arriving at the mouth of the bottle. A hush, then a single wet syllable. He poured a thread into the waiting sauce and stirred. The ladle moved with subcutaneous circles, slow enough to not be noticed, precise enough to be remembered by the camera. His hand shook once, barely. Then unexpectedly a smile surfaced and vanished, the faintest curve, not delight but recognition. A man hearing his own name after years of being called something else. On the van's monitor a detective leaned forward. "Freeze there," he said. The image held, bottle tilted, seam of tape catching light, his wrist bones like small hinges. "Roll," the detective said, voice level like he was playing a record. At 12:27 p.m. the second wave of employees pressed into the room. Air pressure shifted, voices swelled. A spoon fell and pinged like a fired shell casing. Trays rattled as they hit tables. "We're at capacity," a cashier muttered, counting heads. The camera array chased gestures, hands reaching, sauce passed, steam moving like weather across faces. The old ritual was intact, the communal lunch hour performing its dependable spell. It felt for a moment as if the storm might forget itself and go quiet. At 12:31 p.m. a man in a gray tie hesitated with his first spoonful, as if his tongue had brushed a live wire. He blinked, swallowed, reached for water. The microphones caught the scrape of his chair. At 12:32 p.m. he dropped, the thud softened by linoleum and then sharpened by metal as his knee collided with the table's edge. A woman at his side said, "Are you okay?" And then louder, "Hey, hey, are you okay?" When the body wouldn't answer, the sound of the room changed key. The detectives in the van did not speak. At 12:33 p.m. a pale young woman lurched, hands clamping her abdomen as if something inside had decided to turn. A man coughed a string of syllables not in any language and speckled the table with red. Faces turned toward the serving line, toward the steam, toward the spoon still in David's hand. "Move," an officer asked, mouth already open for the order. The detective shook his head once, pained, the calculus visible in his jaw. "We need the act," he said, barely above a whisper. "We need him on it." At 12:34 p.m. three bodies convulsed in a stuttering choreography that no one had rehearsed. Spoons cascaded in metallic rounds from a dozen tables, the sound indistinguishable from distant gunfire. "Don't eat! Stop! Stop eating!" someone shouted, knocking bowls away. Sauce streaked the air in panicked arcs and landed hot on forearms, on cuffs, smearing into badges and name tags. The neon hummed harder, flickered, then steadied, making the sweat on faces shine like oil. In the kitchen, the camera above the shelf watched David's hands. He replaced the bottle without label between the vinegar and the sesame oil that actually was. He smoothed a thumb across its blankness as if quieting a child, then reached for the ladle again. The smile had gone. The mask was perfect, his face a ceiling with no cracks. Yet his shoulders rose a fraction with each breath, a tide you could only measure against the edge of a dock. At 12:36 p.m. a server broke from the line and staggered, palms on knees, breath ragged. "Something's wrong," he said to no one and to everyone. His body folded in on itself, a pocket collapsing. The van door slammed from the inside as the detective stood. "That's it," he said, voice no longer surgical. "Go." The first two officers moved, then the second pair. Radios ticked alive on belts, small insect noises. In the cafeteria, a young man near the soda fountain swayed, caught himself on a table, and then didn't. He hit the floor and rolled onto his side, eyes open, as if startled to find the tile so close. At 12:37 p.m. the threshold between watch and act dissolved. The detectives threaded through the panicked mass, palms up. "Police, move aside, police," riding a current of bodies headed in the other direction. The cameras still rolled, their lenses drinking the angles of fear. A tray used as a shield, a hand clutching a throat, a mouth whispering pleas without sound. The sound of spoons falling did not stop. It throbbed like a rain that had found its storm. They reached the counter. Up close, the heat from the steam tables felt like breath. The sauce gave off its familiar perfume of peppers and garlic and something else the detectives could not yet name but would learn to. David looked up, and for the first time his eyes showed a reflection. The shape of a man in a badge, coming toward him with hands half open, the old caretaker finally confronted. "Sir," the detective said, and nothing more because the choreography had to be clean. David's hand went to the shelf by a route it knew by heart. Fingers closed around the unlabeled bottle. The room narrowed to that gesture, plastic yielding, tendons lifting under skin, the small twist that opens a mouth. Overhead, a fluorescent tube stuttered and then held, casting white across the bottle's belly until it turned translucent. In that light, the bottle seemed to fill with a paler liquid, like hospital saline, like mercy made visible and hung in bags beside beds. A paramedic knelt 3 yards away, pressing 2 fingers against the neck of a woman whose lips had gone the color of damp ash. Someone sobbed. Someone prayed. The mask on David's face did not crack, but the storm inside tilted the bottle a fraction more, as if drawn by gravity toward its final act. "Stop," the detective said, softer than the panic deserved, as if speaking to a child balancing on a railing. For a heartbeat, the room held still, suspended in its own breath. The cameras did not blink. The bottle gleamed, every scuff and fingerprint turned to light. You could have mistaken it for an Roman IV bag caught in a fluorescent glare, ready to drip life into a starving vein. Instead, it waited to feed the storm it had helped create. The frame froze there, plastic lifted, cap loosened, the blank label flashing white as a name erased. And the light made it look exactly like an Roman IV bag, a promise inverted, a cure turned weapon, hanging invisibly between the hand and the pot where trust still steamed. At 6:42 p.m., the canteen ceased to be a place of food and became a chamber of law. The doors broke open with a sound like bone splitting, hinges trembling under the rush of boots. Stainless carts rattled as officers pushed through steam, the hiss of overturned pots and the heavy clang of pans striking tile. Heat rose thick from stoves left on, fogging the visors of those who stormed in, mixing with the acid perfume of garlic, vinegar, and something metallic that had no place in a kitchen. The storm inside that had long been invisible now erupted into view, a storm not of rain but of steel, shouting, and the sound of a mask being torn from a man who had worn it too long. David Cole stood behind the counter as if still serving, apron stiff with starch, ladle resting in a pot whose surface shimmered in the fluorescent glow. His shoulders slumped, yet his face retained that neutral mask, the expression of a man unchanged, even when every eye in the room was pointed at him. The storm had lived inside him for years, its thunder quieted beneath polite greetings and bent posture, and now it was here in the open, painted across every sweating officer's brow, every trembling worker hiding behind an upturned tray. The detective nearest the pot lifted its lid. Steam roared upward like a beast unchained, blinding him for an instant. He coughed, waved it away, and the metal clattered back into place. 2 evidence bags unfurled like dark wings, gloved hands descended on the counter. The plastic bottle without a label was raised into light, its cloudy skin wet with condensation, the cap ringed with red fingerprints that looked less like stains than like seals of intent. Beside it, a notebook was pressed flat on the counter, pages swollen with grease and years of handling. Officers bent low, reading, their brows knotting tighter with every name scrawled in the cramped script. The question came without ceremony, plain and cutting. "What's in the sauce, David?" The detective's voice had none of the theater of television, only the dry patience of a man who had asked this question of too many others before. David's hand twitched, a storm tremor beneath the skin. He did not look at the pot or the bottle, but at the far wall where paint peeled behind the radiator. His mouth moved, lips dry as parchment. "It's already inside them," he said, each word pulled from him like wire from flesh. The answer struck the room with more force than the raid itself. Forensic units moved fast, scooping ladles of sauce into sterile containers, sealing caps with practiced motions. Vials were lined like soldiers on the evidence table. One officer read off chain of custody codes, his monotone voice swallowed by the noise of steel trays tumbling from a shelf knocked in the frenzy. The sauce left streaks on the floor as if it had a will to spread. When the first field test strip bled color under the liquid, the silence in the room became unbearable. By 7, 11 p.m. The laboratory confirmed what the air had already whispered. The compound inside the bottle matched precisely with the toxins retrieved from blood drawn hours earlier at the hospital. Lines of data cascaded on the screen, but the words spoken were simple. It's the same. Confirmation. Closure for some, but only the beginning of something larger. The notebook lay open on the table, pages stiff as old skin. Lines of names filled every leaf, each marked with dates, each crosshatched in red or left to linger in black. Some were names of employees long gone, others of janitors and cleaners, faces that no one remembered clearly. Yet as the pages turned, the circle widened. There were names from the town itself. Residents, clerks, a retired librarian, the pastor of a small church. Ordinary lives, ordinary appetites, tethered now to the storm of resentment that had lived in the cook's chest. On one page a phrase was repeated like a chant. Asterisk fed faithfully every noon, every year. Asterisk. The officers read aloud, voices stumbling. This one's from Main Street. This, he doesn't even work here. The notebook was no longer evidence, it was revelation. The mask had slipped fully now, exposing not one day's crime but a geography of grievance stretching years into the past, bleeding into the veins of a whole community. The detective lifted the book, careful as if holding scripture. "Why these people?" he asked, almost whispering as if the ink itself might answer. David's face remained neutral, but his eyes glistened with the gleam of fluorescent reflection, not tears. He gave no reply. Perhaps silence was his final mask, the only one he trusted not to betray him. The storm churned behind it, though, seen in the trembling of his hands now shackled to the steel table, in the twitch at the corner of his mouth that might have been a smile or might have been a spasm. Around them, the canteen looked like a battlefield abandoned by its soldiers. Chairs overturned like casualties, trays scattered like broken shields, steam curling upward as smoke after bombardment. Every sound was amplified. The hiss of cooling metal, the rustle of evidence bags, the scrape of pens on police forms. It felt less like an arrest than a ritual, the unmasking of a man whose resentment had simmered into poison, whose storm had chosen its own hour to break. An officer turned to the last page of the notebook, expecting closure, a final entry to cap the record. Instead, there was a sentence written darker than the rest, the ink pressed so hard it dented the paper beneath. The words were simple, almost casual in form. Asterisk next time, no canteen. Asterisk. The sentence lay there like a blade on the table, cold, gleaming, promising that the storm had not ended but merely shifted terrain. The room's temperature seemed to drop as the meaning took root. It was not just the employees. It was not just the building. The storm inside David Cole had mapped itself onto a wider stage, and the mask he had worn through decades of service had concealed ambitions larger than any soup pot could hold. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, and then steadied. Officers looked at one another in silence, the notebook between them, the bottle glistening beside it. Outside, night settled over the town, unaware that its name already lived on the last page. The canteen never reopened. Its doors were sealed with boards, and behind them the tiled floor lay silent, stripped of tables, stoves, and the rhythm of lunchtime chatter. In its place, the company installed vending machines, mute metallic towers that hummed softly, dispensing sealed packets and plastic-wrapped meals. Workers queued with bills and coins, their eyes fixed on the glass fronts, watching candy bars and bottled sodas spiral into trays. No one lingered in the hall where once the smell of broth and garlic rose. Now the only scent was faint machine oil, antiseptic, and the chemical sweetness of packaged bread. The storm inside the building had passed, but its echo lingered in every gesture of avoidance. They brought their own meals in small containers, stacked neatly in insulated bags. In the break rooms, microwaves groaned as reheated leftovers filled the air with uneven scents of curry, noodles, and rice. Conversations grew quieter. People avoided eating in groups larger than 2 or 3, as if the act of dining itself carried suspicion. The The ritual of sharing had been dismembered. Every spoonful carried a shadow of doubt, every swallow a trace of fear. The mask of routine was worn tightly, yet the resentment underneath was visible in sidelong glances toward any communal food. Outside, the community sought a way to stitch the wound. A memorial was raised in the town square, a massive stainless steel tray mounted on stone, its surface engraved with the names of the dead. Flowers, always white chrysanthemums, were placed in its shallow basin, their petals wilting quickly in rain and heat. The tray, once a vessel of nourishment, had become a permanent ledger of grief. Children pressed their hands to the cold metal as their parents whispered explanations too heavy for their age. The storm inside the town had found its monument but not its end. Each year on the anniversary, families gathered at dusk with candles. They stood in silence, faces lit by thin flames trembling in the wind. Some carried photographs, others clutched silver spoons passed down from kitchens long closed. The spoons had once meant togetherness, the daily intimacy of shared meals. Now they were tokens of betrayal, reminders of the moment when sustenance turned into sabotage. What had once reflected light now seemed to absorb it, each curved surface carrying the weight of memory. In abandoned storage rooms of the company, dust settled on crates of unused cutlery. Metal dulled, stacked high and forgotten, a collection of mute witnesses. The storm of that day was embedded in every object, as if resentment had left fingerprints that no chemical could erase. Workers who passed by quickened their pace, refusing to glance inside, for the silence of those rooms carried more accusation than any words. The company tried to rebrand, to mask its history with new logos, new paint, new slogans promising safety. But no campaign could alter the memory of gurneys lined in hospital corridors, or the sight of white chrysanthemums covering coffins. Trust, once poisoned, could not be reheated or repackaged. It remained cold. Employees clocked in and clocked out, their lunches carried from home, their eyes avoiding the corner of the campus where the boarded canteen stood like a mausoleum. Reporters who returned years later found the building unchanged. Neon lights inside flickered intermittently, still wired to forgotten circuits. Through a crack in the boards, one could see the long counters stripped bare, the air stale with the odor of rust and old grease. A single silver spoon remained on the floor, half hidden by debris. Its bowl was stained with a patch of dried sauce, a brittle crimson that no one had bothered to clean. The spoon had once fed dozens, passing through hands in moments of routine hunger. Now it lay abandoned, its reflection warped, embodying both the intimacy of trust and the depth of betrayal. The last witness to a meal that had turned into a funeral sat under stuttering neon. Each flicker of the light struck the spoon's surface, making it gleam like a pulse, faint and faltering. It looked less like metal than like a dying heartbeat, echoing in an empty room. The storm inside had quieted, but the mask it left behind was permanent. The resentment that once boiled in pots now lingered in silence, in steel, in memory. And as the neon light blinked again, the spoon's reflection trembled as if alive, one final beat before darkness.